Bam.
This is Kelly Lowery, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
Hell yeah. Kelly's been on the show in the past. Usually we were talking about Haiti, but today he's like, hey, let's talk about this food bank that I work at. So I thought that's a perfect idea. We cover a lot of topics, as you know, Kelly, but let's talk a little bit about what your guys' mission is there. And, let's dispel some myths, too, about what a food bank may or may not do.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to kind of share about the work that we're doing here at the food bank. And, we're facing some challenging times right now. The reality is that there are, every single month here in Kern County where I live, more than 100,000 individuals that on a monthly basis rely on emergency food access because they just don't have enough to make ends meet. And with the rising cost of living and all the different challenges economically, income inequality, and all sorts of different variables, there's just a lot of people that rely on emergency food access every single month. And so, that's the work that we do here, is fighting food insecurity here in Kern County. It's not unique to where we are. It's a problem that is really endemic all over the country. And it's something that a lot of people really, unless they themselves experience it, are probably not really aware of how deep the problem really is.
When it comes to someone supplementing what they're able to provide for themselves, how much food are we talking about? Are we talking about 5 bags of groceries? What are we looking at? And then how often?
Yeah. So what we try to do is we try to offer every food insecure individual that accesses resources from us on a monthly basis, on average around 20 pounds of food when we call it engagements, that's what we call whenever somebody accesses emergency food. I mentioned a minute ago that there's probably 100,000 or so individuals on a monthly basis that we're serving here in Kern County. The reality is that we actually measure things by what we call engagements, which means how many times in a month that somebody accesses emergency food. Because unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of people are accessing emergency food more than once in a month, and so they're not just unique individuals at that 100,000. We're actually seeing many more engagements than that, and I'll give you the actual number. So here in Kern County in California, in January of 2023, we had 92,000 engagements. So 92,000 times somebody received emergency food, on average around 20 pounds of emergency food during that month of January 2023. Just 2 years later, in January of 2025 of this year, that number ballooned to well over 200,000 engagements. And so and the highest number actually was in November, just a couple months prior to that, November of 2024, the highest mark that we've had in quite a while, with over 225,000 engagements in a single month. So, that's 150% growth in just 2 years. And, the need has been growing steadily over the last several years, and that's the environment that we find ourselves in today. And then now on top of that, we're facing even more challenges with funding, budget cuts, and all sorts of other dynamics at play right now.
I don't know if this is true, but there's 1 million people in Kern County?
Yeah, so the population of Kern County is almost 1 million people. And, when you look at food insecurity rates, what they tell us nationally is that the food insecurity rate nationally is around 10%. So in a country of 330 million people, I mean, you're looking at 10%. That's a substantial amount of Americans that would be classified as food insecure. And then, California being the largest state by population like that, we have the largest population base, and the number is actually higher percentage-wise, even in California, which is sad also, because when you consider that within California, the area where I find myself here in Kern County, we have a higher food insecurity rate even than California and the national average. The numbers statistically tell us that the number is around 15% here in Kern County of food insecurity. But anecdotally, I can tell you, because of the fact that it was last measured about 2 years ago, that now the number is even higher than that, probably closer to 20 or more percent. So 1 out of 5 people that you engage with on a regular basis here is food insecure and accessing food from a food bank. And like I said, unless you yourself are one of those 5 or are related to or engaged with somebody who is, a lot of times people don't really understand that the need that's there.
Yeah, it has a lot of things to discuss within that. What you're talking about. I mean, the Central Valley of California is one of the most fertile places on the earth. I mean, we're feeding the nation from that part of the state, and yet there's people that are food insecure. What does food insecure mean? I mean, that's a term that sounds sort of PC-ish, but there must be some kind of value that creates
Yeah.
that status.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned about where we're located here. And I'll just mention that every year, the 2 highest producing counties in America in terms of agricultural outcomes are always Fresno and Kern County. Those are the 2, Fresno, Tulare, and Kern County, the 3 kind of biggest counties that make up the Central Valley, are always in the top 3 of the highest ag producing counties in America. And so that just adds to just the incredible, unfortunate irony of food insecurity, that here in the place that actually feeds really the world, you have some of the highest levels of food insecurity. And I think there's reasons why. I mean, I alluded to it a second ago that there's great income inequality that I think leads to that. Cost of living is the largest driver of that, in my opinion, in terms of, the cost of living in California being so high, and yet wages haven't sort of kept up with the cost of living increases and things like that, and inflation. So those are definitely I think the driving forces. But you asked about the definition of food insecurity, and the U.S. government actually is the one that sort of created the definition of food insecurity. And so the great thing is that people aren't dying of hunger. You mentioned at the outset at the beginning of the show that we've talked about Haiti here on your podcast in the past. I've had the fortunate opportunity to travel to Haiti, more than a dozen times just since 2009, and I've experienced all the different varying degrees of hunger and food insecurity that you could imagine coming from a place like that.
Mhm.
And thankfully, here in America, we don't really have hunger the way they have it in some other places in the world, like places like Haiti. But the reality is that food insecurity is still a very, very challenging thing for a lot of families. And food insecurity is defined as lacking access to enough food to meet the nutritional needs of your family. That's the USDA, U.S. government definition. So lacking access to enough food to meet the nutritional needs of your family. And so you really start looking at what people have access to. And there's a lot of places around us at different points, like where we're located here in Kern County, and where the food bank is actually located here in East Kern. You can look at that, and there's areas and neighborhoods that have no access really to healthy food options. They're not near a grocery store, and so you see health outcomes being challenged by the fact that families don't have access. So really that word access, Pete, becomes sort of the operating term there. Is like, what do people have access to? And so when we're talking about food insecurity, we're really talking about access to the healthy foods that people need in order to meet the nutritional needs of their family.
You talked about Kern County, Fresno County. These are major producers. I mean, State Route 99 is just packed full of. It exists because of agriculture. We have a main city in our Central Valley called Stockton. We make a lot of food around here. So Stanislaus County, which is to the north of you guys, and this is sort of the norm. Like whatever product you see in the store, cheese, we commonly make more cheese than all of Wisconsin. Commonly, sometimes they beat us, sometimes we beat them. Turkeys, turlock, yes, those things go together. Chickens like crazy, and it is remarkable that we can't seem to get over the hump with the ability to feed one another. These are kind of idyllic concepts. Like, why couldn't we do this or whatever that thing is to create that need? Well, one of the conundrums of aid is getting someone reliably off of aid or being a temporary solution to a temporary problem. I know I've talked in the past about these sort of social constructs, and one of the challenges is, and I'm not saying this is you guys, but let's say we've got someone who's addicted to drugs. They're on the street. We're trying to get them off of drugs and off of the street. And once that case management process gets to, hey, successful, we've got this person a job. They're off the streets. They're off of drugs. Job done. There's no longitudinal study to see if they actually thrive after that. Quite often, that person fails and regresses because addiction is really hard. And that person comes right back in that front door at some point. And so that system sort of perpetuates. How does the food bank deal with things like that? How do we get people reliably able to be food secure so that 15, that 20, that 10% shrinks, effectively? I mean, at some point you can't get below, say, 4%, whatever that number is. So that's just sort of how social problems work. But what do you guys do to create a lasting solution to this problem?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, and obviously it applies to social issues across the board. And what I will tell you is that the CAPK Food Bank is not, our mission isn't to end food insecurity. And I know this might sound like a hot take or something like that. You're a food bank and your mission isn't to end food insecurity. The reality is that there's always going to be food insecurity. And the reason for that is because food insecurity isn't the problem. Poverty is the problem. When people find themselves without the ability to fully take care of their own situation economically, or for whatever reasons, whether they're things that are external, that are outside of their control. There's a lot of times when things happen to people that are outside of their control, or whether it's internal. Maybe they're things that they've brought upon themselves that have caused their own issues. Whatever the issues are, the reality is that there's always going to be food insecurity. And really, I think because of the fact that we live in a time, in a society where, like I said, for good, bad, or otherwise, the reality is that there's just an incredible amount of disparity between the cost of living and what people are able to make in a certain area. And anytime that gap exists, you're going to have food insecurity. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that food insecurity is not the problem. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. And so what I'm doing here at the food bank is saying, look, there's other smarter people that are looking at those underlying systemic issues that cause the actual problem of income inequality and cost of living. And until we can figure out how to solve those issues and close that gap, we're going to help people that are still hungry today. If somebody's hungry today, they're not going to be satisfied or made full based on the hope, right? That
Right.
Somehow somebody's working on a way that they would be less impoverished in the future. They're hungry today. And so that's what we do here today is we try to address food insecurity. And that's the difference. And maybe some people might say that's semantics or whatever. I don't think it is. I believe that we can fully address food insecurity. We're not going to end it, because until we can figure out how to end poverty or address that income inequality issue, there's always going to be folks that are going to be in need. And as long as that's the case, that's what we're going to be here to do, is to help people who find themselves in need of assistance until we can figure out those larger underlying issues.
Yeah, we tend to get a little judgmental of people that are suffering and struggling. And I don't know about you, but but some days I just, I can't seem to get on top of that day. And so I struggle, and maybe I make a couple of bad decisions because I'm in scramble mode or I'm in give up mode. That heck, I could weigh a whole lot less if I consistently made good, way less decisions, right? So it's easy to look at me and be like, Pete's a dumb old fat ass. But, I've got depression. I've got a broken body. I've got all these things that make it harder for me to drop weight reliably, right? And so maybe I do need some external help. Maybe I do need to go see my doctor and try to prevent myself from getting diabetes. You get to be hopeless in these cases. And sometimes the family is food insecure because a policy does change and inflation goes up, and there's a bird flu prevention program that limits the supply of egg or whatever. And we're to start political statements. We're just using recent things here, but I think everybody has felt the pinch of the cost of food go up. And I love this, Kelly, when I'm told, when I watch or read the news, like, oh, the cost of food isn't that high, and I'm like, motherfucker, I'm buying food, and I live in a state where they make all the food. Why the hell is it so expensive? And so we can get judgy over folks that are really probably doing their best, and I know me, I've built up a little bit of credit on the bad side, just getting, part of the family through, this time of higher cost of food. Food costs money. I get it. We try to buy quality things. I get all that, but am I by definition food insecure? No, but one thing happens, probably, it's pretty close because there's just not a lot of surplus money where I'm at. Even though we're okay, right? Okay is like one step above insecure in my world.
Yeah. Well, and the other dimension, as I mentioned, about food insecurity is about nutritious needs of your family, and that's kind of what you were alluding to a second ago. I have a buddy who was having a baby shower at his house recently, and I called him. I'm on the way over there. I said, "Hey, is there anything I can pick up for you on the way over?" And he said, "Yeah, we're having a few extra people that we weren't really planning on. Can you stop by the store?" We were just barbecuing burgers and stuff. He's like, "Can you get like some tomatoes and lettuce, just some extra lettuce and tomatoes for the burgers and stuff?" Pete, I got 2 heads of lettuce and like 6 or 8 tomatoes or something like that. It was $20.
Yeah,
it was over $20. And I just have to tell you that, and I was happy to do it, whatever, for my friend, but I had that thought when I was buying it. I thought, if I was a single parent with several kids at home and I was working a low wage job, and I was standing at the grocery store thinking, like, how am I going to provide for my family? One of the first things that's going to go is fruits and vegetables, because they are really expensive, but yet they're one of the best things in terms of nutrition level for families and especially for kids. And so, when we're talking about food insecurity, it's not just a matter of the volume of food, like, the calories and things like that. It's the types of foods as well that we're able to provide for our kids. And it creates this spiral, because then kids get used to eating, chips and top ramen and mac and cheese and chicken nuggets, because we can buy them in bulk and they're cheaper and that sort of thing. And then we wonder why they kind of grow up, and we have this sort of double. We just did a study here at CAPK. We just finished a pretty long, in-depth study around food insecurity here in Kern, and what we found was that in addition to food insecurity among kids, we have an obesity problem among our kids, and really the whole population. And so it makes you wonder, how are we having an obesity issue and a food insecurity problem at the same time? And really, this is the reason why, because the cost of the more nutritional options is so much higher that oftentimes families are left with that first choice of saying, look, I'm going to put the lettuce and tomatoes and the salad type things down, and the fruits and stuff like that down, and I'm going to, in place of that, get a mega pack of mac and cheese and ramen and some other things that I can sort of buy in larger quantities.
It must also be true that when a family is at that limit, where they're having to make those kind of choices, that the parent or parents are working and not home to cook, a sheet pan dinner where you're taking some chicken and fresh vegetables and heating up for 40 minutes, and then bam, there's a healthy dinner, right? but there's no one around to do that. And, so boiling water is easier than turning on an oven. Also, by the way, probably cheaper if you've got a gas stove. So, all of these costs, energy costs, food costs more because energy costs more right now too. And that's another area where it increases cost. So are these families, a lot of families that are kids are cooking at home, and is there some way to get them to cook things that are more healthy or less convenient? But I mean, it doesn't take that long to cook a dinner, but it does take 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we're engaged with in our work here at the food bank is a larger work with the Kern County Food Policy Council. So we're partnering with other organizations that are interested in this work among low-income individuals who are facing a lot of these challenges, and looking at how do we change people's habits in terms of eating and the choices they make in this regard. And so we're looking at all kinds of things. We're looking at programs to increase the level of fruits and vegetables from our local farmers. You mentioned we have some really, really incredible local farming in our area, but how do we get a lot of their product into our kids' schools and change their mindset around these foods? Because once they start preferring these foods and knowing how to cook with them or how to enjoy them and stuff, I mean, that's really where you're going to see the needle move in a lot of ways. But it really brings up kind of another point, which is that we're facing a lot of challenges funding wise to some of these initiatives. We have a program that's called LFPA, which was a federal program that was started a few years ago. And it gave food banks specifically funding. It allocated funding to food banks, not like real money. They don't send us a check or anything like that. But the federal government would say, like, hey, you have, here's some money, a few $100,000. And with that, you can purchase produce from local farmers, local small farmers in your area, to be able to provide those products to folks that are accessing resources at the food bank. And so it's kind of a double positive thing, right? Because it enabled us to introduce fruits and vegetables, an increased amount of fruits and vegetables into the resource pool that we have here at the food bank to give people, but also kind of help the local economy, because the local small farmers, not the big, conglomerate, large packing house type farmers, but the small farmers, the ones that have maybe 5 to 20 acres, or less. It helped them out quite a bit. So that program was started, and there were 3 rounds of that program that were initially slated. And unfortunately, we're right in the middle of the first round of it. And the decision was made at the federal level to cut that program. And so there was a little bit of pressure that was kind of put on folks, decision makers, when they made that decision. So they reinstated the current first iteration, because I mentioned there were 3 kind of phases. So they said, okay, look, you can finish the current one that you're on, but the next 2 are canceled. And so, that's an example of something that was making a real practical difference as it relates specifically to fruits and vegetables and the nutrition level. And, it is a focus of ours here at the food bank to try to increase the nutrition level of the food that we give. I started here in my role here at the food bank about 3 years ago. And when I did, I discovered that right around 25% of the food that we distributed was fruits and vegetables. And we just went to work and made it a goal to try to increase that. And so currently that number sits around 33%, and we're making it our goal to get close to 50%. But it's programs like that help us get there, because we can talk about how food banks work. I would assume that a lot of your listeners probably, if they've never experienced or engaged with a food bank before, probably don't know really how a food bank works, how we get the resources we get. But there is a partnership that has to happen with the federal government, with our state governments, with our local governments. We cannot just rely on donations, because donations alone will never be enough to meet the need. And there's a real reason for that, Pete. You might understand I mean, it's pretty basic incentives, right? Like, we get donations from grocery stores and from other, types of donors. But the reality is that grocery stores and other sort of vendors and things like that, they're not incentivized by what goes out the back door. What they're donating. That's not what they're incentivized by. They're incentivized by what goes out the front door, what goes out in people's carts, right? Because they're a business, and we understand that. And so we, if you put all of your strategy around the donation part, there's just incredible volatility that comes with that, because 1 month you're going to get a decent amount of sort of canned goods donated or whatever. Then the next month from the same store, you'll get you'll get a couple of boxes of marshmallows and a couple of boxes of jalapenos. And you're like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to give marshmallows and jalapenos to families in need? What are they going to do with that, right? So these programs that come from both local, state, and federal resources, what they enable us to do is actually to bring some stability to the resource pool that we have to be able to provide to our neighbors that are in need.
When you tell me that the federal government has cut part of the budget, I mean, this is a very normal thing. Our policies are bound to the budget, and we're always trying to find areas to cut it. I can understand why someone who has no access to Kern County would be like, we don't need to do this anymore, right? This is the people need to bootstrap and that kind of thing. But then there's also the kind of that up and down nature of a food bank and a food drive, and it's like, yeah, I'm going to go out and bring you a whole bunch of yams or whatever, and I'm going to bring you cans and that stuff. But then the next month you're like, by the way, still need more food, so you do need that federal scalability. What's the process? I mean, how do you guys deal with that? What's your megaphone? Because we can always holler about food and education and whatever, these sort of forever topics. How do you guys differentiate yourself? How do you fight? And then if you guys win the fight, Kern County wins and you guys get funding, does that harm? Oh, I don't know. We were talking about Coconino County in Arizona. Does that harm Coconino County because they don't have the team that you guys have? And is this sort of a zero sum type thing?
Yeah. I think to answer your question, I think probably the best way to help people understand a little bit about sort of would be to paint a picture about our resource pool, because I think a lot of times people have a question around when decisions are made to make cuts, from the government side of things or whatever. What's the government's role in sort of the food bank process and that kind of thing? And what I'll tell you is this: in 2024, we distributed 22.5 million pounds of food across Kern County. And I mentioned to you before that we understand what it takes to fully address food insecurity in Kern County. And the reason why we know what it takes to fully address food insecurity is because we know how long our lines are. We also know what the data is telling us around the food insecurity rates. And so I know that, for example, in Kern County, if we have 1 million people, and if our food insecurity rate is around 20%, around 1 in 5, that means that I need to be able to look at that number and say around 200,000 individuals in Kern County need to access emergency food. And if we wanted to provide 20 pounds of emergency food to 200,000 individuals, it's just simple math. You do the math and you say, okay, that's how many pounds of food on an annual basis that we need in order to kind of fully address the need, right? Not end food insecurity, as I mentioned. People are always going to be in that perpetual kind of place of need until we can solve the poverty issue. But we can fully address it, meaning we can provide adequate access to folks, to food for folks that find themselves in that place of need. But when you're talking about numbers with that many zeros, Pete, it's not a matter of just doing a food drive. It's not a matter of just posting up on the street corner and asking people to drop off some cans. Our best food drive that we do here and it's a pretty good one. We'll raise around 30,000 pounds of food. That's a lot. 30,000 pounds of food in one food drive. I mentioned to you that last year we distributed 22.5 million pounds of food. Of that 22.5 million pounds of food, about half of it, a little over 10 million pounds, came from a federal program called TFAP. So TFAP stands for the Emergency Food Access Program, the Emergency Food Assistance Program. And that program is a direct allocation from the USDA. It's a carve out of the Farm Bill. And so it's authorized by Congress. And what they basically do is they set aside, we've had this for decades, really back since the Reagan administration. And the concept is that the USDA purchases full truckloads of food from local domestic farmers to kind of prop up our ag industry. And then they send that food directly to food banks to be able to meet the needs in these areas. And that's kind of a real basic idea of how that works. But to give you an idea of what I was just talking about, over 10 million pounds of food comes from that program. And one of the more recent cuts that was just made was to the TFAP CCC program. So the USDA over the last month has terminated entire truckloads that are going to food banks all over the country. And for us here in Kern County, just our food bank alone, it equated to about, on an annualized basis, about 3.5 million pounds of food. So of that 10 million that I was talking about earlier, about 38% of what we were going to be counting on for this year is not coming anymore. And so we're facing this like double problem where the lines are getting longer, but yet the resources are shrinking. And there's a looming crisis that's happening that I just am trying to make sure everybody understands, because we're trying to do more with less. And so, you know, people often say like, oh, well, we waste a lot of food. You know, there's grocery stores and restaurants that waste a lot of food, and we need to figure out ways to, you know, capture some of that. And those are all great ideas. But the reality is that when you're talking about numbers the size that we're talking about, there's a few percentage here and there of increasing donations from grocery stores or food drives of, you know, 30,000 pounds or whatever. That's not going to move the needle when 3.5 million pounds of food that we were counting on last year, that we had last year, that we're not going to have access to this year, is no longer going to be there. And that's just on the federal side. I haven't even kind of started talking about the sort of the state side, some of the challenges that we have there. And I mentioned that LFPA program earlier. There's another equivalent to that program, which is specific to schools. The federal government had a equal program, not just the one with the food banks, but one for schools, where schools were actually given the same thing to be able to purchase fruits and vegetables from local farmers to put into the school system directly. And that program was canceled as well, in this effort to, you know, kind of reduce the size of the federal government, make cuts. And again, I'm not here to ideologically, you know, speak in favor or against sort of the ideological side of making those cuts from a larger federal standpoint, or, you know, people can decide what they want to about that. I'm just here to say that I believe that food insecurity is a policy choice. We have the resources to be able to fully address food insecurity. If we wanted to fully address food insecurity, in other words, if we wanted to make sure that every food insecure person in a given area, so for my example, Kern County, if we wanted to make sure that every food insecure person in Kern County had enough access to enough resources to meet their needs for their family, we could do it. It's just a matter of deciding that that's a priority and we want to put dollars behind it as a country. And or if we want to decide, no, that's not our priority. Our priority is to send funds to some of these other places around the world or some of these other initiatives here locally or domestically. But I do firmly believe that we could fully address food insecurity if we had the political resolve to do it.
Just doing some fast numbers, if one of your biggest drives is 30,000 pounds of food, if it's 100% transferable, which there's no way that's true, you're feeding, you're giving about 4 people a day 20 pounds of food over the course of a year, and that just doesn't seem like a lot for a county of 1 million people.
Right.
And that's one food drive, right? So okay, there's other resources. So you're right. Like, this is a thing that you have to be able to scale. I guess, is there a number on the transferability of food? I mean, is there like a perfect bag, like 2 cans of yam, 2 cans of green beans, a roast? What is in that 20 pounds? Is there a formula? And then are you guys able to see, like, oh crap, we don't have enough shelf stable whatever it is, or peas or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I will tell you that our goal here is never to be able to. It would be too ambitious for us to assume that we're supposed to be a person or a family's only source of food for a period of time. So we're providing enough resources to supplement, what families have access to. But in that effort, we always try to provide a balanced pool of resources. So we're always looking at fruit, vegetable, starch, protein, typically a frozen protein, frozen chicken, things like that, and juice. So those are kind of the 5 categories that we're always shooting to have on hand to be able to provide to the families that access food on a regular basis. And that's what's really challenging, is because our ability to get those things, really, if we only relied on what's donated from stores and things like that, boy, that would be really, really tough. But one of the most influential ways that we're able to provide those things is actually through our state program. So if you give me a second, I'll kind of like lay out for you sort of the state side. I mentioned to you the federal side, which we get direct shipments through that TFAP program, about a little over 10 million pounds. Now on the state side, here in California, and every state's different. Every state invests in their local food bank system differently. I will say that the Cadillac, if I may, of sort of food bank and state relationship is the state of New Jersey. So the state of New Jersey has a total population of about 10 million people or so. And they have 6 food banks. They have 6 food banks in New Jersey. And their state budget that they write into their state budget to support their food banks is north of $86 million a year, just in support of their 6 food banks. So I had the opportunity to network with some of their food bank leaders recently in a conference that we were at, and what I found, Pete, is that the 3rd food bank, the one right in the middle, 3rd size food bank there in New Jersey, serving a much smaller area than we serve here in Kern County, from just directly from their state budget, gets $12 million a year. Okay, $12 million just to that one food bank, serving one area that's smaller than Kern County where I'm at. So I give you that context to say, now let's look at California. So California, the largest population state in the country, right? And here we are with 44 food banks in California, as opposed to 6 in New Jersey. 44 food banks. And the typical baseline amount that the state of California invests in food banks is $8 million. For the entire state, for 44 food banks, $8 million.
That's like 10%.
When you extrapolate that out across like the food insecurity rate and the amount of the population that's in need, it comes out to about 75 cents a person annually. And so again, we're talking about where's our budget priorities, right? So 3 years ago, the state of California was in a budget surplus. And in that budget surplus, they dropped what they called one-time funding on the food bank system. And so for the last 3 years, we had access to several $1 million. It ended up being like around $150 million for those 44 food banks to be able to purchase food. So we were able here locally in Kern County to purchase fruit, vegetable, starch, protein, and juice, and to be able to provide those to our agency partners and our neighbors over the last 3 years. But it was called one-time funding, because it sunsetted, and it sunsetted literally, it's sunsetting this month. And so after this month, that one-time funding is no longer going to be there, and we're going to be resetting, unless our state legislators do something and the governor does something about this, we're going to be resetting back to that $8 million baseline. And what it means is that over the last 3 years, I've been able to spend around about $125,000 a month purchasing food to have on hand to be able to then distribute out to our agency partners so that they can provide to their neighbors those fruit, vegetables, starch, protein, frozen chicken, meat options, things like that, for the last 3 years. And unfortunately, with that program sunsetting, if the state doesn't come through and see the need for that, and what we're advocating for is that they increase that baseline that was 8 million, that they increase it to 60 million a year, to be able to keep that level at the same level it's at. So and so even in doing that, we still would be behind states like New Jersey and Minnesota and Colorado and some other states like that. But at least we would be able to continue to operate at the levels we're at. If we are not, if our state legislators don't do that, it's only going to add to the critical nature of where we're at right now.
It's funny, the things that are outgoing, we sunset those, but we never seem to sunset those temporary taxes. They tend to become perpetual.
Yeah.
And that's the
well, and here's the other part I want to mention, just real briefly about that is, look, I realize that, we're in this environment right now where there's this real desire to find places to cut, and there's going to be cuts in a lot of places, a lot of programs. There's a lot of attention right now on things like SNAP, things like Medicaid, a lot of social programs that are being cut and looked at to be cut right now through this budget process, both at the reconciliation with the federal budget, or right now we're kind of looking at our state of California budgets, and we're getting ready for the May revise. And so as these social programs are looked at and being either completely eliminated or at least being reduced, the issue, Pete, is that every single time there's a cut to a program like SNAP or a program, any social program at all, what ends up happening is it causes downward pressure on what is the safety net of all of the social programs, which is the food bank. What we know is that SNAP or food stamps, that it is the best use of taxpayer dollars to be able to help people in need of food access is actually SNAP. And one of the things that's being proposed right now at the federal level, because that's a federal program, is that it be reduced by 10% right off the top and then given to the states. And so, in other words, like the federal government saying, okay, California, we used to give you $100 million. It's a lot more than that, but just using that for easy numbers. We used to give you $100 million. Now we're going to give you $90 million, but we're just going to give you the 90, and then you guys handle it in your own state. And if you want to keep the other 10 million, that you got to come up with it, right? You got to come up with the difference. And when you have a state like ours that right now is in a budget deficit, that just means that the 10% of that program is going to get cut. And so where are those families going to go? Where we already have the lines that we have, and now the downward pressure on the safety net of the food bank, because those families that are going to experience those cuts in all those other social programs are now going to find themselves in line at the food bank, maybe for the first time. And I'll just give you a real number briefly, and that is this. If that proposal to the change in SNAP happens, Pete, the financial impact, the fiscal impact on California would be $1.2 billion. Just that 10% piece that California would have to come up with in order to keep SNAP at the level it's at right now, based on the federal government's proposed plan, would be 1.2 billion. And I have to remind you that we're in an unprecedented state deficit right now. So if we're already in a state deficit and they're already looking at making cuts to, everywhere you can imagine here in California to try to balance the budget here, where's that 1.2 billion going to come from? The reality is it's not going to come from anywhere. It's just going to be a cut. And the folks that are going to feel it are going to be low income families who have, been relying on that kind of assistance. And so that brings about a whole nother layer of social issues on top of that are related to food insecurity as well.
Boy, there's a lot in there. There's a lot in there. One is California is fantastically wealthy in terms of inflow of resources, but we are bad at the outflow part. And so we need to feed people. And you're totally right. Like SNAP itself is a problematic program because food stamps are tough to use. Yeah, they give you a debit card, but it's not as simple as it seems. And there's shame involved too. When you tell someone you're going to go to the food bank, or you're on food stamps, there's a negative judgment personally that would come like towards me if I was to do that. And then also someone in that boat externally, like if they're looking for a job or if they have a job and it gets out, like these are essentially hazardous things for someone who's on the edge. They've got trapdoors underneath them. I'm not saying that anybody actually is going to get mad at him or anything, but it doesn't help your situation to have someone know that you are having to go to a food bank. There's a lot of challenges that come with this. I want to get back to the state and local control of this. Is that a better model? And then, like one of my friends he works in the numbers and the buying of food business, and he's great at it, right? But even he talks about, like, when he goes out to negotiate a price for some bulk chicken or whatever from Foster's Farms or whatever, he he's got all these other secondary and tertiary influences on his ability to make this prediction on how many chickens he needs to buy, and where to put them and what does that cost and all these other things. So it's a quite complex system within what he does. It must be even more chaotic for you guys when things like budget cuts come, because what are you going to do to replace that? You have to now spend other resources. I mean, we often want people who work at a food bank, we want you to work for free, or $35,000 a year. But the fact is you've got a family to raise too. And so you need lobbyists, you need people who are great at buying, you need all these people that are great at doing their job just to create some kind of efficiency. But not many businesses, which is what you guys are, not many businesses can withstand a 10% cut of their incoming money, right? Like how does someone supposed to do that? So I guess that's sort of just my little screed on the challenges that you guys must face between hiring high-end professional people, hiring people that know how to fix the very specific problems that you guys have. Is it better for the state and the local governments to have control of this stuff than the federal government?
Well, I mean, I think the short answer to that is no. I think everything that we know is that when you get the government involved with running it themselves directly, it'll cost more. Mm-hmm. It'll probably even waste more and that sort of thing. So we're a public nonprofit here at Community Action Partnership of Kern. We're a public nonprofit. Everything that we do is all public, all our financial statements, everything. And so what anybody would see by looking at the way we operate here at the food bank is that we operate with extreme leniency. A food bank our size, we have about a 60,000 square foot warehouse. As I mentioned, we distributed about 22.5 million pounds last year across one of the largest counties in California, 8,000 square miles of Kern County here. And what my food bank friends around the country, when I tell them that, they can't believe the fact that I tell them that I have 19 staff members to do this, because this type of operation probably takes closer to 50 folks to be able to run. And we're doing it with less than half of that. And we're doing it by trying to be the most innovative and efficient that we can with the resources that we have available to us. I'm thankful for all of our organizational partners that we have around the county. We couldn't do this work without really great organizational partners in every community around our county. But as you talk about resources and that sort of thing, there's kind of two sides to it. There's the operational side, as you mentioned, but then there's also just the food resource side. And, as an agency, we have done a lot of work to maximize what we're doing on the organizational side. It's so that when somebody is interested in helping us with providing food, we can tell them, like, look, the donation that you're making, like we have an event coming up called Gourmet for Good. It's coming up here in June, on June 7th. And because we are efficient and have maximized our organizational capacity at the level that we have, we tell our donors, look, when you donate to this event and help us to buy food for people, that money, that's where it goes to. It goes to providing meals and full truckloads of food to individuals. I'll give you an example. Maybe you don't know this because your friend would as a food purchaser, but I didn't know these kind of things until I got into the work that I'm doing right now. But yeah, I mentioned to you that right before the sunsetting of this state program, I was in the place of purchasing food, and so I can tell you anecdotally that a truckload of peanut butter, that's 22 pallets of peanut butter, regular jars of peanut butter, costs $80,000. That's what it costs. And for a county our size, to be able to provide that out to families and things like that in need, it would last probably about 6 weeks or so, 6 weeks to 2 months, that $80,000. So it helps to have that perspective, because as we talk about the resources that's necessary to run an organization like this, $80,000 it is necessary for things like food purchasing, but also operationally. But we just turn our attention to trying to find ways to have access to more food resources to stabilize what we provide to families and whatnot. And, I mentioned to you a little bit ago about the TFAP cuts that were made federally. That was about 38% of our roughly 10 million pounds of food that we distributed last year. So the reality is that we're going to have about 38% less food for that program in 2025 and moving forward. So what we're faced with, Pete, is this decision. Do we serve 38% less families? Do we look at the county and look at each of the cities and say, okay, we were serving 300 families at this site, at this location, but we're going to have to cut this site down by 38%. So now instead of 300, now we're going to serve 250. Is that what we do, or do we say we're going to still serve 300 families, but we're going to serve those same 300 families with 38% less food that they're sort of accustomed to getting? And those are the tough decisions that we're in the place of having to make right now.
It's like a predicted horrible year for your business, right? Like when there's just 38% less of something coming in the door. Yeah, that's, what are you going to do? And is it even possible to make that up, that 38%? Can you, you can wheel and deal your way to maybe 5% of that. I'm just guessing, but how hard can you lean on local donors, and could they even cover that gap?
Well, we're working hard at doing that, and I'm very thankful for the local donors that we do have here in Kern. We have great partners. We have some large ag businesses here in Kern that are really fantastic partners. Tasteful Selections, the Wonderful Company, Bolt House, Grimway. These are large companies that provide produce and ag products all over the country and really all over the world. And they're great partners here locally, but they can't fill that gap alone. As I mentioned to you, we're talking about 3.5 million pounds of food. And that's a sizable gap. The monetary equivalent of 3.5 million pounds of food, the monetary equivalent was about $4.7 million. That's the monetary sort of equivalent of that many pounds of food that we're just gonna have less this year than we did. And we started talking about Haiti at the beginning, and our mutual friend Benit helped me to understand something a long time ago on one of my first trips to Haiti. I saw we were doing a kids outreach there in Haiti, and we provided these little sandwiches to the kids. And one day I saw this little kid open up his sandwich, and there was no meat in his sandwich for whatever reason. Whoever was making the sandwiches, there was no meat in it. And without missing a beat, the kid next to him opened up his sandwich, and he had 2 pieces of meat in his, and he took one off and he gave it to the other kid. They didn't say a word. It was just, he just saw that his friend didn't have one, and he took the meat off of one of his and gave it to his friend, and then they just kept eating. And that just so moved me, Pete. It just so moved me in a place like that to see that that type of gesture. And I asked our friend Benit about that, and he said to me, he said, Kelly, here in Haiti, we have a motto: if there's food for one, there's food for two.
Yeah.
If there's food for one, there's food for two. And that has shaped really the way we're operating here at the food bank. We're going to continue to serve the lines as long as they are. We might not be able to serve them as much as we've been serving, but we're going to continue to serve the lines as long as they are. They might get a little less, but they're going to continue to be served, because if there's food for one, there's food for two.
When you look at the 44 different food banks in our state, where do you guys rank? Are you guys, more competent, less competent? Do you guys have any idea? I mean, if I had this conversation with the food bank up in Goose Lake or whatever, are they having the same problem? Are they worse at solving it? Is their problem harder than yours? How do I get the context for what well run looks like so that we could, improve other places?
Yeah, it's a great question. Every food bank is experiencing the same cuts that we're experiencing. And so the only difference is that it's affecting every food bank slightly different based on how much reliance that they've had on the federal side of the resource pool. So a lot of food banks do a lot of private fundraising. And so when there's some changes on the government side, it maybe doesn't affect them as much because they privately fundraise quite a bit. Here for us, our sort of resource pool is pretty mixed, and we don't rely on private. We haven't been able to rely on private fundraising to this point at the same level. And so these shifts on the government side have really affected us here locally a lot more, and will continue to. And so, some of our food bank friends, like in Fresno, for example, and also up in Northern California and Southern California, they are located in corporate rich environments. When you look at, our friends at the LA Regional Food Bank, they're located in the middle of Los Angeles, and they've got a lot of really great donors in that area. And so their pie chart of revenue, so to speak, has a lot more on the private donation side, and they don't rely on the government side quite as much. But when you're here in Kern County, and your largest city is Bakersfield, there's not a lot of corporations here that are undergirding the work that we do like they are in other like metropolitan areas. And so it does affect us quite a bit more. But I will say that really it's not just California, but all over the country. Every single food bank is experiencing the same thing: longer lines and less access to resources to be able to meet that need.
Yeah, that's similar in the I guess if you look at the prison system here in California, the place you want to be is San Quentin, not because it's a gentle prison or anything, but it's close to all of the money. And I think it's closed down, but we have a prison way out in East California where you have to go into Nevada to get it. It's called Marysville. And, it's just hard to physically get there. It's hard to get people to want to live there, to work this place. And so it's a similar kind of problem where, you're on the edge of the bay around all these tech companies, around all these major, corporations. Yeah. Getting some funding for some progressive and, neat ideas is a little easier than say, oh, I don't know, Pelican Bay, which is north and beautiful and on the edge on a bay, but not as easy to get to the money. So I can appreciate that. I guess the last question I have for you, and then I'll let you kind of wrap up with whatever you want to talk about. But if you had the ear of President Trump right now, you got a chance to sit across from him and like or dislike President Trump, he is a guy that if you pitch your pitch to him and he likes it, he'll eliminate all the red tape. And I know people that have done this, it's like, this is not a problem. My staff will get this done. So if you had the chance to do that with him, what would be your pitch to President Trump to get him to deal with this problem in a way that would help you guys?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I haven't really thought about it in that context. But if I was in a scenario with President Trump or really any policymaker, I would tell them somewhat similar to what I said to you earlier, which is the food bank network. The food bank network, and I call it that because there are hundreds of food banks all over the country. Literally in probably every county in America, there's a food bank that's working today. Oftentimes in the shadow, not out front, really looking for any kind of notoriety, but just in the shadow, just doing work every single day, trying to meet the needs of Americans who are on a consistent basis unable to kind of meet the regular needs of their family. And so what I would say is that food insecurity is a political choice, and that we can fully address it. I really believe, and I'm what I am working for here in Kern County is to make Kern County the first county in America to fully address food insecurity. And I believe that we can do it by having enough resources, enough access, and enough information. We've already been working hard for the last 20 years building the access points. We have over 200 access points here in Kern County. So we have the infrastructure already in place. So now really the main piece is resources. And as we talked about, there aren't going to be enough food drives or enough donations from grocery stores to be able to really meet the need. It really comes from if we as a society say that people shouldn't go without, people shouldn't have to make choices between paying a bill or providing nutritious food for their family. They shouldn't have to be they shouldn't be forced to sort of be making those decisions. And so the food bank is that safety net. So give us the tools to be able to, while you, meaning the policymakers, are looking at sort of the larger economic situation of how to close that gap between what people make, the income inequality issues with the cost of living, because that's really at the crux of what we're talking about. While you figure out fiscally, whether it's through tariffs, whether it's through all the other things that you're doing, while you're doing that, don't forget that there's a lot of people who get left behind in that. And while you're working on that, because that's something, as you know, Pete, that best case scenario is going to take years to really see the effects of some of those fiscal decisions that they're making kind of at the national level. So while that's happening, give us on the grassroots level here with our feet on the ground and our sleeves rolled up in the shadows give us the tools that we need here to be able to help people in the meantime until we can see some of those things. Give us the tools that we need to be the safety net, to be able to catch those that are left behind in that scenario.
If you guys want to check out the food bank that Kelly works at, here's a link for that. You can see CAPK, is that what you guys call it? CAPK.org?
Yeah, CAPK stands for Community Action Partnership of Kern.
All right, cool. And then in general, here's another asset. And look, all of these things are things you can look locally to see how you can help out, even if it's only going to make a small dent. As much as we've said we need federal help, we all can do things. And so look into that and maybe press that button that says yes and $1 on your your grocery tab. That money, and look, I bypass that thing as much as anybody else. I'm like, man, of course I've got $1. Of course I've got $1 every time I go in there. And these kind of things are ways we can be resilient within our community and help folks out, and maybe ask folks, and don't be so judgmental when they tell you that they have a problem trying to make ends meet, because guess what? That's a very common thing. Anything in closing before we go? And man, I appreciate you taking the time. I know it was a little bit challenging with my eye surgery and everything else to get in here. So I'm really thrilled that we got a chance to do this and cover this exciting topic. Very interesting and certainly needed. But is there anything you want to say in closing before we wrap this thing up?
Well, again, Pete, you're my friend, and I appreciate the opportunity just to hang out with you for a little bit, even if it was talking about the food bank and the work and stuff like that. But the only other thing I would say is I would just encourage anybody that's listening. Oftentimes we think that the only way to help is to make financial donations to something, and believe me, that those really help. As I mentioned before, With every dollar that we get, we put it in the pot to be able to purchase food for folks. That's what we use it for here. So if people are interested in helping us here with feeding people in one of the most food insecure areas of the country, they can look at that link there for our Gourmet for Good event that we have coming up to sponsor that. But beyond that, what I would encourage, because there's people listening and watching this that aren't here locally to us, you have a food bank in your area. And so support that food bank in your area. Take your kids, take your business, your organization over to the food bank and say, hey, how can we help? Can we build some boxes? Can we fill some boxes? Give us Saturday. It'll open your eyes. Let them tell you the stories of what's happening in your particular area. And just volunteer. Roll your sleeves up, put your shoulder under the load, and just volunteer. Give a few hours on a Saturday and see what happens. So beyond just the financial giving, which is obviously important, but the volunteering part. And then I think the last part, Pete, which is really, really important because it goes in line with what we were just talking about, is if you feel like that this is important work that our elected representatives need to understand the priority for, then, maybe you might want to share, your thoughts and your feelings, your stories and stuff with your local officials and just say, hey, we need to support our food banks. We're making cuts everywhere, but that's one area that we need to strengthen the safety net is with our food banks. And so, contact your local officials and say, hey, how do you feel about what the investment in our food banks? You're not making any cuts. What are we doing? Are we strengthening it? And that kind of thing. So those are kind of three things that would really make a direct, measurable difference in the food bank in your area.
I love it. All right, stand by. I'll say goodbye to you, everybody else. I will see you actually later today. So bye-bye.